an economic downturn in the early 70s fueled by the OPEC embargo in response to United States support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, America turned to, once again, an oligarchy class president, Ronald Reagan.
This is very controversial. Does anyone know what Vice President Bush called this in 1980? Anyone? Something DOO economics. Voodoo economics.
Under Reagan, the Sherman-Hatch Trust Act was no longer enforced, allowing for mass wealth due to monopolies, and the closing of factories and outsourcing to other countries coupled with a war on unions all began. The loosening of bank regulations led to America's first crisis since the Great Depression. The crash of '87 and the savings and loan scandal showed the first cracks in the New Deal banking safeguards dam.
The S&L fiasco is not only the biggest act of thievery in the history of our nation, it is the largest financial scandal in the history of the world. No one can predict exactly how much this bailout will cost the American people, but estimates run as high as $500 billion to $1 trillion.
It was the defining moment of the 1980s. October 19th, 1987. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 508 points, the largest single-day drop in the history of the stock market.
The dismantling of the Democratic Party, however, was as clandestine as it was nefarious. The children of the pre-New Deal oligarchy plotted to infiltrate the working-class Democratic Party. They created the Democratic Leadership Council and its affiliated and ironically named think tank, the Progressive Policy Institute, whose executive council included Aetna, AT&T, American Airlines, AIG, Bell South, Chevron, DuPont, Enron, IBM, Merck, Microsoft, Philip Morris, Texaco, and Verizon Communications. The DLC Board of Trustees included senior executives from a handful of corporations such as Koch Industries, Aetna, and Coca-Cola. It was chaired by the likes of Dick Gephardt, Joe Lieberman, Tom Vilsack, Harold Ford, and most importantly, Bill Clinton. It was an organization to bring in right-wing, wealthy, and oligarchy-supporting politicians into the Democratic Party in order to fight against a middle-class society and return America to its pre-New Deal past. Now dissolved since 2001, most likely due to its success and its image in a post-08 crash era and how it would look for the Clintons still trying to run for office, the historical records of the DLC were purchased by the Clinton Foundation. You see, within a two-party system, you need more than 50% to win votes. If a percentage of your party is working for the other party, it only takes a small amount of votes to make sure the other party wins. A vote for the other side gives them a vote and takes one away from your side. All in all, the DLC was like the owner of a championship sports team, paying members of the opposite team to either work against their own team, work for their team, or simply not to play up to their potential. Winning a championship with everyone giving 100% is often challenging, but with even a small percent not giving 100% or giving a percent to the other team, that team has no chance of winning.
Looking. Stops, throws, completes it to Kilmer up at the 30-yard line. Kilmer driving for the first down, loses the football. It's picked up by Jim Marshall, who's running the wrong way. Marshall is running the wrong way, and he's running it into the end zone the wrong way, thinks he scored a touchdown. He has scored a safety. His teammates were running along the far side of the field, Russ, trying to tell him, go back, go back.
You know, I get accused of being kind of moderate and center. I plead guilty.
Oh, a catastrophe! Can you believe it?
I think that they're mostly because there's not support for a single payer. So
Jimmy Traore's put through his own net in comic style, and Burnley lead Liverpool by...
It was one of the highlights of President Clinton's first term, passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, also known as NAFTA. Critics blame NAFTA for the loss of manufacturing jobs in industrial states including Ohio and Pennsylvania. Hillary Clinton helped get NAFTA approved. She held at least 5 meetings to strategize about how to win congressional approval. She helped the White House block opposition from labor and environmental groups, and she was the featured speaker at a crucial meeting. Participants in that event said, quote, her remarks were totally pro-NAFTA. There was no equivocation for her support for NAFTA at the time.
Oh, I think that everybody is in favor of free and fair trade, and I think that NAFTA is proving its worth.
I think on balance, NAFTA has been good for New York and America.
Casser, second poteau, c'est bien fait, envolé. Oh, il se la met dans son but là. Idriss Kameni. Mais que s'est-il passé? Kameni qui se l'est mise tout seul ou pas?
If single-payer health care is going to mean complete takeover by the government of all health care, I'm not there.
We're a Big Tent party, so we have the ability to absorb and be unified with people on the far left and, you know, that are center right, and still have, you know, the same people calling themselves Democrats.
With this Trans-Pacific Partnership, we are writing the rules for the global economy. America is leading in the 21st century. Our workers will be the ones who get ahead.
Do you think New York State should recognize gay marriage?
No.
No. Okay.
I believe that marriage is not just a bond, but a sacred bond between a man and a woman.
For every blue-collar Democrat we will lose in Western PA, we will pick up 2, 3 moderate Republicans in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And you can repeat that in Ohio and Illinois and Wisconsin. The voters who are most out there figuring out what to do are not the blue-collar Democrats. They are the college-educated Republicans who lean Republican or independent and in the suburbs.
Há excesso de confiança enorme, há lava no meio dos centrais bem abertos aqui, o guarda-redes.
They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
Há excesso de confiança enorme, há lava no meio dos centrais bem abertos aqui, o guarda-redes.
Come out on January 8th and make John McCain the next president of the United States.
Há excesso de confiança enorme, há lava no meio dos centrais bem abertos aqui, o guarda-redes.
The truth of the matter is that my policies are so mainstream that, you know, if I had said the same policies that I have back in the 1980s, I'd be considered a moderate Republican.
This is why the Democratic Party hasn't created any significant change, only window dressing in the last few decades. Even with the majority, it gave America a Republican health care bill. All of the Clintons' major accomplishments were Republican as well. When the Clintons took power, it was obvious they were working on behalf of the oligarchs. They pushed for the dismantling of the New Deal. They championed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 that devastated welfare programs that went 70% to poor children.
I signed this bill because this is a historic chance where Republicans and Democrats got together and said, we're going to take this historic chance to try to recreate the nation's social bargain with the poor.
They championed the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 that led to the imprisonment of more African Americans than were slaves at the end of the Civil War. Compounded with a for-profit prison system with prison labor, created a greater slave labor force than America fought a civil war to free itself from, mostly from blacks that had committed non-violent marijuana usage crimes, even though their white counterparts used marijuana at the same rate.
Many people of color don't know or fully understand how this system of mass incarceration was constructed, why, and the devastating consequences for our communities. And the Clintons, had an important role. They escalated the drug war and the Get Tough movement far beyond what the Republicans had done, while at the same time dismantling the federal social safety net and transferring billions of dollars away from child welfare and housing into a prison building boom unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the early 1990s, urban black communities were suffering from economic collapse. A literal depression was affecting those communities. The unemployment rate had quadrupled in many urban areas. Neighborhoods that were solidly working class, were suddenly turning into ghettos practically overnight. And, at that moment, our nation had a choice. We could have responded with bailout packages, economic stimulus plans. We could have invested in those schools so that the young folks trapped in racially segregated communities might have some hope of making the rough transition from an industrial economy where they once relied on factory jobs to a service-based economy where they needed actually a college education even to make it into the middle class. We could have responded with a wave of care, compassion, and concern, but no. Instead, what did we get? We got the war on drugs, the Get Tough movement, and the evisceration, the end of welfare as we know it. And really the election of Bill Clinton marked the turning point for the Democratic Party, where the Democratic Party decided that in order to win over those so-called white swing voters, the folks who had defected from the Democratic Party in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, in order to get those folks, they were going to have to begin proving to that segment that they could be tougher on them than the Republicans had.
They championed the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act that overturned the New Deal Glass-Steagall Act that prevented Wall Street from using people's savings money for high-risk gambling.
This is a day we can celebrate as an American day. It is true that the Glass-Steagall law is no longer appropriate to the economy in which we live. Today what we're doing is modernizing the financial services industry, tearing down these antiquated walls and granting banks significant new authority.
The Clintons also championed the Commodities Futures Modernization Act, which exempted credit default swaps from regulation. This was despite the warnings of Brooksley Born, a chairperson of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. Born lobbied Congress and the President to give the CFTC oversight of off-exchange markets for derivatives, in addition to its role with respect to exchange-traded derivatives, but her warnings were ignored or dismissed by Clintons and Congress.
Beginning in the 1990s, deregulation and advances in technology led to an explosion of complex financial products called derivatives. Using derivatives, bankers could gamble on virtually anything. They could bet on the rise or fall of oil prices, the bankruptcy of a company, even the weather. By the late 1990s, derivatives were a $50 trillion unregulated market. In 1998, someone tried to regulate them. Brooksley Born graduated first in her class at Stanford Law School and was the first woman to edit a major law review. After running the derivatives practice at Arnold & Porter, Born was appointed by President Clinton to chair the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which oversaw the derivatives market.
Brooksley Born asked me if I would come work with her. We decided that this was a serious, potentially destabilizing market.
In May of 1998, the CFTC issued a proposal to regulate derivatives. Clinton's Treasury Department had an immediate response.
I happened to go into Brooksley's office, and she was just putting down the receiver on her telephone, and the blood had drained from her face. And she looked at me and said, "That was Larry Summers. He had 13 bankers in his office." He conveyed it in a very bullying fashion, sort of directing her to stop.
She was overruled, unfortunately, first by the Clinton administration,
and then by the Congress. In 2000, Senator Phil Gramm took a major role in getting a bill passed that pretty much exempted derivatives from regulation.
They are unifying markets, they're reducing regulatory burden. I believe that we need to do it.
It is our very great hope that it will be possible to move this year on legislation that in a suitable way goes to create legal certainty for OTC derivatives.
I wish to associate myself with all of the remarks of Secretary Summers.
In December of 2000, Congress passed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Written with the help of financial industry lobbyists, it banned the regulation of derivatives.
Once that was done, it was off to the races. And the use of derivatives and financial innovation exploded dramatically after 2000.
This led to the crash of '08 and a return to a second Gilded Age, a repeat of the free market disaster of the pre-New Deal era, with income disparity equal to and not seen since the Gilded Age. The Clintons also championed the 1996 Telecommunications Act that put the media into the hands of a small group of super wealthy. At first, it resulted in mass right-wing propaganda dominance of the airwaves. Later, when the oligarchs took over the Democratic Party, it was a propaganda arm for oligarchy on both sides that duped people into taking what they thought were different sides, but was actually become virtually the same, with only superficial branding differences based on rural versus urban, modern versus provincial, and old versus young.
It's so hard nowadays with all the gangs and rap music. What about robots?
Oh, they're everywhere.
I'm Sam Waterston of the popular TV series Law & Order. As a senior citizen, you're probably aware of the threat robots pose. Robots are everywhere, and they eat old people's medicine for fuel.
Even though underneath the parties were relatively harmonious, they had succeeded not only in manufacturing the consent of the overthrow of our democracy and the ushering in of an oligarchy once again, but now sustaining it through subterfuge. Democratic leadership was now in the bag for the oligarchs. They had effectively become synonymous with the Republican Party and their values. Optically, they would make some concessions to the working and middle class, but policy-wise, they were crusading their destruction. How the rest of the Democratic Party went along with this is not so clear respectively to their motivations, yet the cause and end result is eminently clear. In 1976, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of legalizing bribing politicians through a ruling called Buckley versus Vallejo. The plaintiffs were the usual Birch oligarch suspects, the '76 McCarthy campaign, the Libertarian Party, whom David Koch was the vice president candidate just 4 years later for, the American Conservative Union, which was founded by the likes of Frank Meyer, a libertarian philosopher, and is now chaired by Matt Schlapp, who previously served as vice president of federal affairs at Koch Company's public sector. The Republicans were, for the most part, instantly in the bag for this new legalized bribery. The oligarchs now had their puppets running the Democratic Party with the Clintons. Here's the part that's not so clear. The rest of the Democratic Party fell in line with this new bribery as well. They could have maybe taken short-term losses, not taking the bribes of special interests and of lobbyists, and remained steadfast on the side of the middle and working class. After all, just because something's legal doesn't mean you have to do it if it's immoral. Lying, adultery, being verbally abusive at all are all legal, but people of moral character generally try to avoid such activities. They could have used some judo tactics and used the right wing's weight against themselves. As wages flatlined, banking scandals emerged, and the greatest Wall Street crash since the Great Depression occurred, the Democratic Party could have held the Republican bribery by the oligarchs over their heads and used it to defeat them politically. They could have said, see, this is what happens when you get in bed with the oligarchs. Instead, we had to wait for documentarians like Michael Moore and a scrappy independent senator to inform the masses of what had been happening for 40 years to the country since the Democratic Party chose to fight fire with fire and take a can't beat 'em, join 'em policy of also taking bribes to match the funding of the Republican election campaigns. Because of taking the sides of the oligarchs and keeping quiet instead of using the bully pulpit, Few, even in the media, knew that wages had flatlined, the middle class had become a minority, or that half the country became either poor or in poverty. The Democrats' motivations were to stave off short-term losses with the hopes that congressional dominance would allow them to pass working and middle-class policy. It has to date been a massive failure. They have become beholden to the money that gets them elected. What's the point of winning if you can't pass the laws you want to pass? I mean, it's lose-lose, right? You lose either way. You either lose the election or you lose by winning the election, yet still must vote like your opponents in office. You're not trying to win to get into office and pass policy that is antithetical to your opponents, then why do it? Take the loss and let the Republicans fail, and then use that failure against them in the next election. Strategically, this is just a huge failure. Now, they sort of rationalize this by this sort of incrementalism. Well, if we get in office, we can incrementally do a little bit here, a little bit there. But if you're taking one step forward and 5 steps back, I mean, you can point to the one step forward and optically show your constituents and say, look, we did a little bit there. Isn't that good? But in aggregate, you're moving backwards, right? I mean, 1 plus -5 is -4. In the long scheme of things, you're going the wrong way.
You're going the wrong way!
You're going the direction that the Republicans and the oligarchs want you to go. You're not going forward at all. You just can use that politically to maybe point to when you want to win an election. Is it because politics has now become more of a profession than a public service? The fact that 3 of the richest 5 neighborhoods in the country are in the D.C. area could point to that. Maryland, which borders on D.C., now has the highest population of millionaires per capita than any other state. It's not New York, it's not California, it's Maryland, where the D.C. bigwigs live. It's difficult to buy the rationale that it's only to remain victorious politically, yet it's not what they want ideally, seeing that when the economy collapsed, they could return to their base and ignore their donors and lobbyists and see even greater victories. Instead, they held to their donor-compromised policies and experienced tremendous losses. Perhaps it's the fact that prior to legalized bribery, their base, largest pool of political influence was labor. They went from campaigning in union halls with cheap coffee and donuts to now hobnobbing at $350,000 a plate fundraisers with celebrities. Whatever the reason, the party leaders are now either chosen or systematically rise to the top based on their wealth and or their ability to procure bribes from the oligarchy class. Nancy Pelosi's husband owns a real estate and venture capital investment and consulting firm, and they are estimated to be worth over $50 million. Dianne Feinstein's husband is a billionaire and president of an equity investment management firm. She has received scrutiny due to her husband's government contracts and extensive business dealings with China and her past votes on trade issues with the country. Critics have argued that business contracts with the U.S. government awarded to a company, Perini, controlled by Bloom, may raise a potential conflict of interest issue with voting and policy activities of his wife. URS Corp, which Bloom had a substantial stake in, bought EG&G, a leading provider of technical services and management to the U.S. military, from the Carlyle Group in 2002. EG&G subsequently won a $600 million defense contract. In 2009, it was reported that Bloom's wife, Senator Dianne Feinstein, introduced legislation to provide $25 billion in taxpayer money to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corp, a government agency that had recently awarded her husband's real estate firm, C.B. Richard Ellis, what the Washington Times called a lucrative contract to sell foreclosed properties at compensation rates higher than the industry norms. The United States Post Office has entered into an exclusive contract with C.B. Richard Ellis to sell buildings that currently house post offices. Sarah McCaskill's husband founded a capital firm. McCaskill is famous for countering the scrutiny of owning a $2 million private jet by saying that normal people can afford a private plane. Perhaps being out of touch from being obscenely wealthy also plays a role. All of this, coupled with the Democratic Leadership Council, created total control of the Democratic Party by the oligarch class. The lion's share of influence coming from the Koch brothers or Koch-affiliated libertarian and conservative organizations. With the Republicans already for decades tucked neatly into the oligarchic bed, this left no political resistance to destroying the middle class, creating New Deal. At least the Republicans are upfront about their tactics. They boldly tout their tactics of making the rich richer, so some will trickle down on the peons. The Democrats disingenuously still claim to be the party of the middle class outwardly. They do policy-wise is antithetical. In 2015, the middle class was once again a minority in America.